The future of sport, the Rugby Reset. It is episode 1. Sport Industry Insider meets. It's myself, Chris McHardy, and I'm delighted to welcome into the conversation now the CEO of World Rugby. It is Brett Gosper. And Brett, I say a very good afternoon to you.
Nice to talk to you from home.
Strange times these, Brett. They really are. These are unprecedented times. Are the corridors of power at World Rugby, the cogs still turning?
They are indeed, yeah. I don't think we've had so many meetings and been so close to each other since this crisis has begun. We've learnt actually how easy it is to meet on Zoom or Skype or whatever. And what used to take airplane flights and organising of hotels and all the rest of it, we can get a lot done this way. It's maybe not how I'd like to be working for the rest of my career, but it's got some advantages in many ways over the real world.
For the whole of sport, the sporting industry at large, Brett, it is all a lot of people, I guess, looking themselves in the mirror. There's been an awful lot of soul searching. Has that been the case for rugby as well?
Yeah, look, I'm not sure it's soul searching so much, but it's, in a first instance, trying to understand what we're up against, trying to work on contingencies around calendar, and trying to understand where the pressure points are in terms of financial stress around the different unions that are our member unions. So I guess it's freed up some lateral thinking and some alternatives that everyone's looking at. And those contingencies have allowed some creativity so that you're not just thinking about how do I survive the next few months, 6 months and so on. It's a lot of this thinking in contingency around both your financial structuring and so on, but also around calendars and so on, become quite helpful in the way you may well proceed in the future.
The Rugby Reset. Give us an overview of kind of what the discussions have been and what that might look like.
Most of it in terms of what's been brought on by COVID-19 has been the realisation that obviously live sport, particularly sport filled with stadium, particularly sport that is managed across the hemisphere and has vast international travel, is probably the most hit of any event we can think of at the moment. It's likely to be the last to be back to normal in many ways, and so we're trying to plan as long term as possible on many scenarios that are down. So the reset really is trying to form contingencies around when we might be back, and in those different times reconfigure a calendar that can try and refine value from broadcast and sponsors and eventually crowds, and at the same time really work out if some of those scenarios might actually be even more fit for purpose for the future of the sport itself. In the meantime, everyone's looking at their own balance sheets. Everyone's looking at what's really needed. There's obviously a huge prioritisation test on what is really necessary now. What do we need to cut? What can we put off? What are those forced savings we can make? There are always some natural savings, but it really is finance and creativity around the calendar. And of course, in any back-to-play scenarios, scenarioing all of the different elements of the medical aspects of return to training for players, individually, collectively, return to games, maybe behind closed doors, potentially in the beginning, and then when will crowds roll back in. So I guess we're very focused on the next 12 months with an eye on what that may create for the future going forward as well.
If you mind me asking, Brett, I mean, who is driving some of those conversations? You mentioned there two very important stakeholders, the broadcasters and the sponsors. Have they been very, I guess, not unforgiving per se, but the demands that are being placed on you to fulfill the fixtures, what have those conversations been like?
Well, there are conversations that we're in and there are those we're not in. We're very fortunate at World Rugby and for the wider game that we held a very successful World Cup last year in 2019, and we're headed towards a hopefully very successful, but certainly a very lucrative World Cup if all goes well in France as well, with a lot of guarantees already committed by France 2023. So we've been able to straddle, from a World Rugby point of view, the dangers of budgeting. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't some uncertainties going forward with broadcasters to 23. Some of those contracts haven't been signed. A lot of those sponsorship deals haven't been signed as well. And obviously those conversations are slightly more difficult in the current uncertainties. But certainly our member unions and leagues that are managed by our member unions, like the Championship in the South, like the Six Nations, they're having those conversations with their broadcasters. And, they're very complex conversations about recovering inventory at some point in time in either the fiscal or calendar year. As you can imagine, broadcasters are under pressure at these times, and sports properties are something they'd love to see back in their inventory very quickly, but it's not as easy as that, obviously.
I was interested to read, Brett, comments from Case Al-Dalai, the Asian Rugby Federation chief, of course, a man over here in the United Arab Emirates. He's done wonders with UAE Rugby. He's been commenting over the course of the past week that maybe more needs to be done, that maybe, just maybe, Asian Rugby can have a greater say in kind of rugby's direction moving forward. Is it an opportunity, I guess, to reflect a little bit and maybe from a structural point of view, perhaps alter the way that rugby was heading and maybe look at the future and get some more kind of key stakeholders around the table and really have a good, open, frank discussion about what can be done moving forward?
Yeah, I think, look, there's a convergence of a number of things. There's the crisis that we're managing, and I think World Rugby is doing a good job leading the key issues in that crisis, which I've mentioned, is calendar and finances. But there's also two other events which are happening. We're at the end of our 8-year strategic plan, and we're in the process of rewriting through quite a collaborative process with all member unions and regions, a new strategic plan for the next 8 years. Until that strategic plan then starts to get into motion in terms of it being produced, we're very focused on the immediate crisis at hand.
One thing I think we can both probably agree on, and if we were all in the room together, we would all agree on, is that consumer habits are changing. The way that we interact, the way that we engage with sport is changing. I look at the streaming platforms, whether that be Netflix, Amazon. We know that Facebook have their own plan to partner with various sports. I mean, is that something that is an ongoing conversation, that you are looking perhaps to the future of how we, the punters, the fans, journalists around the globe, actually interact with the sport of rugby as well?
Of course. What's important for us is to ensure that rugby remains as simple, as attractive as possible, taking into consideration aspects of player welfare and so on. But ultimately, we need to engage fans, we need to engage new audiences, we need to engage younger fans also for the future of the sport, and they're consuming sport in new and different ways. And we also have to balance out our desire to be broadcast to a maximum audience. In traditional terms, that usually comes from free-to-air, with other money-generating opportunities that may be through pay and other new platforms that are emerging. But we've got our eyes and ears open to all platforms that are open to us. But what is important is that our game remains attractive, and that it's shaped in a way that it can be consumed in these new ways on new platforms and remains a high-value eyeball collector for advertisers, for other commercial interests, so that we can continue to invest money back into the growth of the game. And we're focused on that in terms of how we broadcast our product and how the product presents itself, particularly in the Rugby World Cup and the HSBC Sevens and at the Olympics. They're the big game changers globally to attract new audiences.
Yeah, there's no doubt, and I go back to it, the Rugby Sevens at the Olympics. I think it was the first time in 92 years back in Rio in 2016. There is no doubt that was a huge success. There have been wins, and I look back at the recent 2019 Rugby Union World Cup, record numbers. I think we are close to 55 million audience domestically in Japan. I mean, you must take great heart from those successes in recent years, Brett.
Yeah, they're, as I said, they're very big audience accumulators, in fact, as well. We feel we measure a fan base via Nielsen on a rolling regular basis, and we know that both of those two events, a Rugby World Cup or an Olympics, 6 weeks of a Rugby World Cup or 6 days that we appear at an Olympics, which lasts about 2 weeks, each attracts almost a 10% increase on our 300 million fan base at each moment. And that's almost as equal men and women across the globe. And of course, the Olympics drives new fans and audiences in markets that aren't the traditional rugby markets. Rugby World Cup as well, but tends to also drive the traditional markets. But what we've seen at this Japan World Cup is a whole new market coming out of Asia, and in particular Japan. So both of those events have been a resounding success, I think, on the field, but they've created and engaged and captured the imagination of new fans around the world. And that's really the role of those two events in different forms of the game.
This Rugby Reset, I believe it's a $100 million stimulus package that has been put forward by World Rugby. Maybe just give us a little bit of details as to where you expect that money to be spent and how that will keep rugby moving forward during these unprecedented times.
What we're doing at the moment is collecting the various financial situations of particularly the 12 unions who are most hit by a reduction in revenue by the loss of inventory. And they tend to be the unions that are in both the Championship and the Six Nations, as well as Japan, as well as Fiji, but also other emerging nations that are in cash crisis because of the lack of inventory and so on. So we set up an expert, more independent group that will review all of those demands and try to make that amount of money last as long as possible for the maximum number of unions. So we're in the middle of that process currently. And the idea of this is to keep unions as strongly operational as possible over a period that could be the worst case scenario, which is no rugby at all played internationally until the early part of next year. I think you've got to start from a worst case scenario and hope that that won't be the case, but that rugby will come back earlier and so on. But we want that money to go as wide as possible internationally in terms of our member unions and regions, and as long into the distance as it can to cushion some of those cash holes that are happening because of this inventory loss.
You give us a bit of an insight on that point. You're absolutely right. It is only prudent that you prepare for the worst case scenario. You've said it there, Brett, 2021. I mean, give us a bit of an insight, if you can, as to how much dialogue you're having with medical chiefs and what the kind of prognosis is. I mean, what are the expectations sitting here today on when we will see rugby being played once again?
We don't have precision on that. We're tracking an enormous amount of medical information and the COVID virus spread and the differences in each market and so on. And Aina Falvey, who's our Chief Medical Officer, has done some terrific work with the Chief Medical Officers around the world in gathering that information and hypothesizing. But there is no precision on where precisely it leads us in terms of a gradual return. There are some estimations, but it's very difficult to get a real precise gauging on that. But what we're trying to do is look into all of the aspects, as I say, of return to training for players, return to training for groups and the sizes of those groups. How soon will travel pick up, as we say, is probably going to be one of the last things that's going to happen. Looking at experimentation, learning from other sports, sitting down with other sports such as football, the NFL, AFL, NRL, and just work out what might be some stadium protocols. Are half full, quarter full, spacings possible, viable? So we're looking at every aspect of it to work out. And we're hearing news that many of the governments, particularly in the United Kingdom, where I'm based at the moment, are talking about the desire to get sport, whatever that sport might be, whether it be football and other sports, back up and running as early as we possibly can, just to drive some good, feel-good entertainment for obviously a fan base or a population around the world, which is looking for some good news and looking for something to look at and watch and turn some smiles on. So we're all looking at it, but the short answer is there is no precision on when that might be.
Sport is an escapism, whilst there will be those that say right now it's not important. To some it really is, because it is an escape from these times. So just so that I'm clear as well, I would imagine there is a phased aspect to all of what you are discussing and planning. There would be no problem. World Rugby would have no problem playing matches to empty stadiums. Is that right?
Yeah, of course, if that is alleviating some of the revenue issues, which it would around broadcast in the majority of our inventory in 15s and 7s, then we would obviously consider that would be part of it. We also feel that there's likely to be an in-country domestic pickup of the game earlier than there'll be cross-border. So there'll be cross-border within regions, and then the final phase will be, let's call it international, continental, transcontinental, or trans-hemisphere in our case. That's likely to be the very last form of international travel from a sporting sense, and very large crowds likely to be quite late in the day too. Now, when does that mean? We don't have a precision on that yet, as you'd well understand.
In terms of spacing, how much have you gone into detail in looking at what that would look like? If we take, for example, a 50,000 seater stadium, are we looking at half full? Are we looking at a third full? How do you envisage that coming online?
I'd have to admit we're not far down that track in terms of precise plan, and maybe some of our host unions with these huge stadiums. World Rugby don't own a stadium in itself, but some of our unions are looking at this. I mean, there's also a trade-off. There are the complexities of coming into the stadium, the queuing, the exiting, the risk involved, the perceived risk by people just entering an atmosphere where there's 25% or a 50% fill, and also the aspect of the economics. I mean, if your stadium is 25 to 50% filled, sometimes the economics of the costs involved in opening a stadium like that don't add up as well. So there are all sorts of complexities around that, and certainly what has to happen is that fans have got to be feeling that it's safe and they want to come back into a safe environment, and that's obviously part of the discussion that's involved.
How do you yourself see it, Brett? Is this more of an evolution, or are you seeing this, is this being viewed in World Rugby HQ as an opportunity for a revolution of the game?
A lot of the conversations that are happening around this crisis are leading to some very open-minded scenario playing that hadn't been the case prior to this. So some of the entrenched turf protecting conversations that may have been there prior to this crisis seem to have melted away in a very positive way, in the sense that there could be some new alternatives coming out of this crisis. I know I'm talking very cryptically, but these conversations are happening, they're encouraging, and they're positive, but they haven't completed. And until they complete, we haven't made the progress we want them to make. But there's all the signs that we could well have a shape of the game that, for all stakeholders, is a more fit for purpose calendar shaping the game.
And don't you worry about that, Brett. I know you have to dodge some of these because, of course, you have stakeholders to answer to, and a lot of these conversations remain ongoing. But would it be fair of me to say that the Nations Championship, which I know was thrown out before this, that is an option that is back on the table, that the various stakeholders may well be looking at now, discussing that again and seeing if it could actually come to fruition?
I certainly think that coming out of this crisis, those conversations continue. In some form, there will be more meaningful international matches with a more adequate calendar for all stakeholders, and hopefully also providing the opportunities for the emerging countries to get tier one competition in the right way. So although the form of the Nations Championship won't come back precisely, nor in the way it was managed financially, which was a guarantee provided by a marketing company and so on, I do think some of the strengths of what was debated at that time are coming back to the table in a good way.
What about that? That's, I guess, the opportunities that a situation like this presents and presents themselves to the various individuals. What about victims of this? Is it an absolute shoe-in that, unfortunately, given the nature of this, given the uncertainty and the unknown nature of it moving forward, that there will be, I guess, collateral damage?
Look, I think this is a terribly, deep crisis for many industries. Obviously, it's a devastating crisis medically and in human terms, and we all know about that. But yes, certainly, I think it will create extremely difficult conditions for whether it be clubs, unions, and so on, and no one is protected from losing their business in this environment. As I said before, our job is to try to ensure, as best we can, that our member unions can stay operational through this crisis. There are no guarantees of that, and there are certainly no guarantees that rugby clubs and other sporting organisations can completely weather this storm.
And I was interested as well last week to read, and it was a story that made a lot of headlines, Brett, Novak Djokovic coming out to state that he will not be forced into taking a vaccine. That's if the ATP over in tennis were to make that mandatory. I mean, in terms of rugby, if we get back travelling again and vaccine does become available, I mean, are these players going to mandatory have to take these vaccines to ensure that they can run out onto that paddock?
We haven't got to that point yet. It'd be very draconian to create to oblige anyone to take any vaccine, but there'll obviously be safety criteria that if people want to play, they'll have to adhere to. And we, as I said, we've not progressed to that point yet where we're considering, obviously the testing thing is an issue in many countries at the moment. But certainly if you're going to try to play before there is a vaccine available to players, then there's got to be a very high level of testing and understanding what a protected environment is. And when the vaccine arrives, I'd be surprised that people were unwilling to take it because it is obviously something that will protect everyone's lives.
You've been in this job now almost 8 years, Brett. I mean, undoubtedly, is this the biggest challenge that you've faced in your position to date?
Well, this is the biggest crisis that the sport's been through, and therefore, if you're CEO of a sport, unquestionably, there's not been anything like it. I don't think there hasn't been. I don't know what you could compare it to in sporting terms.
I just wonder, from your background previously, before joining World Rugby, I think back in July 2012, you were hugely successful in the advertising space, the advertising industry. What have you kind of taken out of that, and what have you've seen you've been leaning more on over the course of the past 4 or 5 weeks that perhaps you thought to yourself, wow, I've not actually had to tap into that resource for quite a long time now?
I think if you come from a marketing and a communications background, at the end of the day, you're very conscious of what the ultimate consumer or fan is thinking and wanting and desiring, and being very aware of your product and how it presents itself to the world. And obviously, the average, in many ways, the consumer and the fan is the same thing, but a sporting fan is a consumer with a huge passion and love, and not just making a choice, whether it be through apathy or convenience or whatever else. A fan has a great love for the sport, believes rightly they're a stakeholder in the sport. So I think everything that we're doing and everything we try to do at World Rugby is with the fan in mind and our audiences in mind. Obviously, our number one priority is player welfare in the aspects of the safety of the game and so on. But we're very much, we have very much in mind how the fans are going to be through all of this. And so, bringing our product back as quickly and as safely as we can is very top of mind.
In terms of moving forward, how fans will engage and interact with the sport of rugby, have you got a thought on that? Will it be return to the norm, or will we see more virtual elements, do you feel, added that I guess increases the viewer experience?
I think there'll be more experimentation. We're talking, we've been talking to some people about the virtual side of it. Can virtually drop audiences in if a game is played in front of no audience. You can virtually apply reactions of crowds as if the same actions were happening of a drop ball or whatever. And all of those things, I'm sure, are going to be experimented in during this time, particularly as spectators may not be able to enter the arena in the first instance. But ways of consuming this has made people feel very comfortable with being online. Face-to-face meetings have moved very comfortably online. I think dealing with your phone, watching sport on your phone, watching highlights and so on. This is only going to accelerate those technological disruptions that provide opportunities to engage fans in new ways as well. and also provide commercial opportunities as well. So I think this is bringing, it tended to be the new younger fans that were driving this, but at the moment it's actually the crisis that's driving the experimentation among fans of all ages, and that's interesting for the sport, I think.
Before I let you go, Brett, I know you're a busy man. I've got to get your thoughts, some quick fire questions if I may, because you're a man that grew up with rugby. You're a rugby player yourself. In terms of your hero growing up, who's the man that stood out above all others?
Probably Gareth Edwards, I'd say, as a young kid watching Gareth Edwards play. And at that time I was a scrum half, funnily enough. So he would probably be the standout rugby hero, I'd say, at that time. Closely on the heels of probably Jean-Pierre Rive, who I was a bit older, and then had the pleasure of playing in the same rugby club as him. So a couple of heroes from the rugby world.
And tell me this, Brett, and all that you've achieved, what's the, I guess, best piece of advice that you've been given that stayed with you through until today?
I think the main one in advertising, you've got to have a point of view on something. And I think, I used to have a boss that used to say, if you haven't got a point of view, get one fast and make sure it's good. And it means you've got to think ahead all the time. And sometimes even when you haven't got the evidence-based research or the metrics and so on, you have to form a point of view. You have to think deeply about something. So yeah, it's getting a point of view, getting it quickly as best as you can. And that's important. It's important in a meeting room. It's important as you prepare for meetings and so on. I guess the other thing that always reigns in my mind too, and I live in an environment of committees, and committees can do good things, but they're only good because there's some individuals in those committees really driving things forward and having courage. And David Ogilvy, who was a famous ad guy, who was the head of the agency I first worked for, he used to say, search all of the parks in all of the cities, you won't find statues of any committees. And I think it's important always to remember that you can hide behind a committee, but it takes one or two people leading those committees to really make some brave decisions. I think we're doing that at the moment.
Yeah, fantastic answer that. And last one from me, Brett. Obviously in these times, you've used the word, it's your word, it's collaboration is another buzzword. In terms of the sports that you look to, obviously in your position as CEO of World Rugby, any sports that you lean to that you look over and think, you know what, you guys are doing it well, I could learn a thing or two from you?
Look, I think in this crisis, we're all learning off each other and trying to learn off each other. We've had, as I said, conversations with the NFL, with the AFL, with the Bundesliga, with all sorts of organisations who are all trying to find their way through this crisis in the best possible way. It almost reminds me of what we do around the areas of player welfare and concussion, where everyone's in this together. Everyone's trying to find solutions. There's no we want to be the only ones to have the best solutions. Everyone wants to help everyone get through this crisis from a sporting sense, and that's a really nice thing to see. All of the sports trying to work together to find answers and get through this crisis, which we will eventually. But the goal is to get through it in the best possible way.
Brett Gosper, CEO of World Rugby. I cannot tell you how appreciative I am, Sport Industry Insider as well, that you have spared half an hour or so of your time. I know you're a busy man, so thank you so much. I wish you personally all the very best, and I wish World Rugby all the very best during these uncertain times, and fingers crossed in 2021, roll on 2021, it comes out much stronger than it was when we entered 2020, Brett.
Thank you indeed.